What happens when a normal man is gradually exposed to horror until he becomes part of it? Joachim Peiper, before ordering massacres, was a silent witness to atrocities committed by others. Where does the point of no return lie? If you think people are born evil, this story will change your mind. We'll see how the SS environment created a system where violence became routine, and how this process of desensitization remains relevant today for understanding contemporary genocides.
Peiper's appointment as Heinrich Himmler's personal adjutant in June 1938 represented more than a simple career advancement. It was entry into the beating heart of Nazi terror, a role that would expose him to the most intimate mechanisms of the extermination apparatus. Not a mere observer, but a privileged witness to decisions that would seal the fate of millions of people. But what did it mean to be Himmler's shadow? The position granted him unprecedented access to the corridors of Nazi power. In this new role, Peiper crossed the thresholds of places that would become synonymous with Nazi horror. His visits to the concentration camps of Neuengamme and Sachsenhausen weren't simple bureaucratic inspections, but a deep immersion into the daily reality of systemic violence. Here he didn't just observe, he absorbed, normalized, internalized. The emotional detachment that characterized Peiper emerged with chilling clarity during his participation in the Action T4 program. In a post-war interview, he described with clinical coldness the killing of psychiatric patients. The action was carried out before a circle of guests. Very soon, they moved no more. No disturbance, no empathy, just the detached observation of a human elimination process, as if describing a scientific experiment. Peiper's transformation from ambitious youth to cold executor didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual path of desensitization, where each exposure to violence made the next more acceptable. A process that psychologists today would recognize as the progressive erosion of moral barriers that normally prevent human beings from committing atrocities. Peiper's social ascent found consecration in his marriage to Sigurd Hinrichsen in June 1939. Not a simple union, but a symbolic ritual celebrated according to SS ceremonial, with Himmler himself present as guest of honor. This event marked Peiper's definitive incorporation not only into the Nazi military apparatus, but also into its social and ideological fabric. At a moment when Europe was about to plunge into the chaos of war, Peiper was building a family life in the shadow of swastikas, intertwining his personal destiny with that of the regime. The marriage represented for Peiper a further rooting in the Nazi system. The union wasn't just a private matter, but a political act demonstrating his complete adherence to SS ideology and values. Himmler's presence at the wedding wasn't coincidental. It meant approval, belonging, protection, in a regime where personal and power relationships merged. Peiper had obtained the highest possible social recognition. Peiper's ability to live an apparently normal life while witnessing and being complicit in unimaginable horrors represents one of the most disturbing aspects of his figure. Like many Nazi criminals, he maintained a sort of moral compartmentalization that allowed him to separate the brutality of his work from his family life. This duality reminds us that the perpetrators of history's worst crimes aren't always recognizable monsters, but often ordinary people who gradually renounced their humanity. In 1941, something fundamental changes in Joachim Peiper's life. Forget the image of the cold bureaucrat observing horrors from a privileged position. Now Peiper crosses the thin line between being a witness and being an executioner, taking command of the 11th Company of the Leibstandard SS Adolf Hitler Division on the Eastern Front. This transition is more than a simple career change. It's the moment when Nazi genocidal theory transforms into bloody practice through his hands. On the Eastern Front, Peiper finds the perfect terrain to concretize the brutality he had seen others exercise. The war against the Soviet Union wasn't viewed by the Nazis as a conventional conflict, but as a war of annihilation against an enemy considered subhuman, and Peiper fully embraced this vision. The episode that perhaps best illustrates his metamorphosis occurs in the Ukrainian village of Krasnaya Polyana. After discovering some of his soldiers killed and mutilated by Soviet forces, Peiper doesn't simply order a military reprisal, but the complete destruction of the village and the execution of all its inhabitants. It's no longer about witnessing violence, but personally orchestrating it, being its director. Peiper's tactics became so systematic and brutal that his units earned the nickname Flamethrower Battalion. It wasn't a casual title. Fire became his signature, a tool of methodical terror. Entire Ukrainian villages were reduced to ashes with their inhabitants still inside, in a campaign of terror that aimed not only to destroy but to terrorize anyone who dared oppose German forces. The brutality reached unimaginable levels in the village of Yefremovka, where, according to various testimonies, 240 people were burned alive inside a church by order of the SS under his command. This was no longer random violence or wartime excess. It was systematic, methodical, planned genocide. This escalation of violence wasn't limited to the Eastern Front. 2 years later, in September 1943, Peiper brought his brutality to Italy, to the small village of Boves. Despite local partisans having returned German prisoners as requested during negotiations, Peiper still ordered the execution of 24 men and 1 woman, then having the entire village set ablaze. A gratuitous act of terror that revealed how violence had now become for him not a tactical necessity, but a first operational choice. What makes Peiper particularly disturbing isn't just the brutality of his actions, but his lucid awareness of terror's strategic value. In one of his personal letters, he writes with chilling clarity that our reputation precedes us like a wave of terror and is one of our best weapons. This isn't a soldier overwhelmed by the madness of war, but an officer who has internalized and rationalized violence as a preferential tactical tool. And the Nazi regime, far from condemning these excesses, celebrated them. For his brutal actions, Peiper was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross with oak leaves, one of Germany's highest military honors. Himmler himself, his former superior, personally congratulated him via radio, saying, "Heartfelt congratulations on the Knight's Cross, my dear Joachim. I am proud of you." In a perverse system, Peiper's brutality wasn't an anomaly, but exactly what the regime expected and rewarded. The decorations pinned to Peiper's chest were but the beginning of an even darker chapter. When a man is rewarded for his brutality, what limits remain for him to surpass? The Malmedy Massacre provides an answer that still makes military historians shudder today. In December 1944, the German Reich was with its back against the wall. Hitler, In a last desperate attempt to reverse the fortunes of war, orchestrated the Ardennes offensive, entrusting precisely to Peiper one of the most crucial roles, to quickly break through American lines and reach the Meuse River. It was no coincidence that the most desperate mission ended up in the hands of the man who had made terror his personal signature. The pressure on the SS commander was immense. His superior, Chief of Staff Fritz Kramer, had given him instructions that resonated like an authorization for barbarity. "I don't care how and what you do, you just have to reach the Meuse, even if you have only one tank left when you get there." These words weren't just a military order, but a moral free pass that would have devastating consequences. Fate willed that on December 17th, 1944, at the Bognes Crossroads, near Malmedy, Peiper's Kampfgruppe crossed paths with an American convoy. This wasn't a combat unit, but about 30 vehicles with minimally armed soldiers. For the German war machine, it would have been simpler to capture them and proceed. But Peiper, now accustomed to solving every obstacle with extreme violence, made a decision that would forever brand his name on the list of the most ruthless war criminals. Frustrated by the idea that prisoners might slow his advance, he ordered what had become routine for him: summary execution. 84 American soldiers were gathered in a snowy field and mowed down with machine guns. Their bodies were abandoned in the snow, as chilling testimony to how brutality had become standard operating method for Peiper's SS. But this was just the beginning. In the following days, as his unit advanced through the Ardennes, the trail of blood lengthened frighteningly. Survivors told of systematic executions, of American prisoners and Belgian civilians eliminated without hesitation. The final toll was horrific: 362 prisoners of war and 111 civilians killed in just a few days. It was as if, once crossing the threshold of the Malmedy Massacre, every shadow of humanity had been definitively erased. Nemesis, however, was around the corner. The same determination that drove Peiper to eliminate every human obstacle in his path could do nothing against logistical obstacles. The fuel-devouring panzer tanks ran dry. On December 24th, exactly 1 week after the massacre, Peiper was forced to abandon his precious armored vehicles and order a retreat on foot through enemy lines, leaving behind the wounded and American prisoners. Military defeat, however, didn't mean moral condemnation from his superiors. On the contrary, the perversion of the Nazi system reached its apex when, in official German reports, the actions of Kampfgruppe Peiper were described in laudatory terms. The massacre of unarmed civilians and prisoners wasn't considered a crime, but an example of military determination worthy of praise. If the Reich rewarded massacres with medals, how would the victorious democratic world respond? Peiper's story after the war reveals a disturbing paradox. Condemned to death for undeniable crimes, he found himself free after only 11 years, protected by an invisible network that crossed the new frontiers of the Cold War. When American forces finally captured Joachim Peiper on May 22, 1945, the hunt for one of those principally responsible for the Malmedy Massacre seemed to have reached its conclusion. Justice appeared within reach. But the post-war world would prove more complex than expected, with its new alliances and new threats that would redraw the boundaries between justice and political convenience. In 1946, in the historical irony of a trial held precisely in the Dachau concentration camp, Peiper found himself seated in the defendant's dock alongside 73 other former SS. The defensive strategy adopted by the former commander revealed his nature. With a mix of arrogance and calculation, he formally assumed responsibility for the actions carried out by his men,
while maintaining a crucial distance from specific events. "I never gave execution orders," he repeated, while testimonies told a very different story. The verdict arrived on July 16, 1946. Death by hanging for Peiper, an apparent victory for justice. But here begins the true paradox. That same rope, ready to embrace the war criminal's neck, was never used. The capital sentence was first commuted to life imprisonment, then incredibly reduced to 35 years in prison. And not even those 35 years were ever served. On December 22, 1956, just 11 years after the end of the war that had devastated Europe, Peiper walked through the prison gates a free man. The surprising release wasn't by chance, but due to precise political pressures and the influence of HIAG, the Mutual Aid Association of former Waffen-SS members, which acted as a sort of underground protection network for Nazi criminals. In the new landscape of the Cold War, former enemies suddenly became strategic resources. The militant anti-communism of men like Peiper proved more valuable than justice for the victims of the Third Reich. Reintegration into German society proceeded with surprising ease. First Porsche, then Volkswagen offered him managerial positions. The Germany of the economic miracle seemed willing to forget its past, but not everyone shared this selective amnesia. The unions, mindful of what Nazism had done to the working class, rebelled against the presence of a war criminal in corporate ranks, forcing both companies to fire him. Peiper never completely abandoned his past. In secret, he continued to attend former SS gatherings, participated in comrades' funerals, kept alive that underground network of nostalgics who had never truly renounced the ideals of the defeated Reich. In 1972, perhaps feeling hounded by memory that refused to fade, Peiper moved to France, to Treves, a surprising choice. Precisely in the country that had seen some of the worst atrocities perpetrated by his men, the former SS officer decided to settle, living under his real name but using the pseudonym Rainer Buschmann for his work as a translator. But the past has a tenacity that even the most sophisticated protection systems cannot overcome. In 1976, his identity was discovered. France, with its wounds still open, couldn't accept the presence of such a symbol of brutality. On July 14th, irony of fate, precisely on the day when France celebrated its revolution and its values of freedom, a group of anti-Nazi activists set fire to his house. When rescuers extinguished the flames, they found Peiper's charred body holding a pistol. A last attempt at defense, perhaps, or a symbolic recall to that violence that had characterized his entire life.
Joachim Peiper's trajectory forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Evil doesn't arise suddenly, but grows through small, almost imperceptible steps. Psychological studies on desensitization reveal how ordinary individuals can progressively anesthetize themselves to violence, rationalizing their actions as necessary or justified. This banality of evil isn't an isolated phenomenon of the Nazi regime. We observe it repeating in the Rwandan genocide, in the Yugoslav wars, in Gaza. The real danger for any society isn't monsters born as such, but normal people who, immersed in systems that reward cruelty, gradually slide into the moral abyss. The disturbing question we must ask ourselves today doesn't concern only the past. In what ways does our contemporary society normalize forms of violence? What ethical compromises do we accept daily as inevitable? Recognizing the signs of this dangerous drift represents the only true immunity against the repetition of history that, in truth, unfortunately, too often seems to repeat itself.